Hey everybody, we're excited to be back for another webinar. Today we're going to be talking about data foundations, laying the groundwork for your AI strategy. I'm Josh Scott. I head up Enterprise Solution Engineering here at Sparq, and I've brought with me today some of my nearest and dearest or closest and dearest friends that we're going to talk to you about data today. So before we get started, before we get started, I just wanted to do a few housekeeping rules. We want questions. We want this to be a dialogue rather than a one-sided conversation. Even though there are five of us that'll be all kind of talking back and forth, we want to hear from you. So please, if you have any questions, drop your question in the chat, and we will be sure to answer it. And Laura is going to be helping us as well, monitoring those questions to make sure that we don't miss one. And we'll spend time, especially at the very end. If we don't get your question during the webinar, we'll catch it at the end. Also, because we are geeks and we tend to use geeky words, we're going to put a glossary of kind of data definitions and terms in the chat here in just a second. And that may be something that you can follow up with later if there's something you're like, what does Ken mean by X? And you can look it in there, and that way you'll be able to stay on the same page. And we'll do our best not to use terms that people don't understand. We want to make sure this is a conversation. So if we say something that we think might need additional commentary or definition, we'll do that in real time as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce folks from our data and AI practice here at Sparq. Stephen, if you don't mind getting started with an introduction and then passing it to somebody else on the panel, we'll get started.
My pleasure. Thanks, Josh. My name is Stephen Anderson, and I run our data and AI practice at Sparq. I'm very happy to be having this conversation with all of you today and introducing a few other members of the team. Been in technology a long time, about 4 decades now, working across a number of different domain spaces, some of them overlapping and deeply integrated with data and machine learning over the course of that time period. But excited to be continuing this conversation with all of you today. I'm going to pass it off to Ken Cavner.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me today. My name is Ken Cavner. I've been working in AI and machine learning for at least the last decade. I've been in technology for about 30 years now. And here at Sparq, I work in the AI and machine learning group. I'm going to pass it off to Anthony Rodez.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Rodez. I'm a principal data scientist here at Sparq, working closely with Ken, Steve, and the rest of the team here on focusing mostly on data from a data science perspective, but also engineering, AI, ML as well. So really excited about this conversation today. I'll hand it off to John.
So John Clapper, I assist in leading the data engineering side of the practice, and I've been in data engineering for at least the last 10 to 15 years. Done a bunch of different jobs other than that as well, but really enjoy the data side of things and excited to be here with everybody.
Perfect. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. One of the things, Stephen, I'll pick on you first. You and I partner a lot, and obviously with other members on the panel as well, but you and I tend to be involved in early stage discussions with our clients around this whole area of data, AI, data specifically, AI more broadly. And one of the things that we're seeing kind of in the current economic environment that we're facing is everybody wants, I find almost universal desire to engage in data modernization, data strategy, to build for AI, because AI is that buzzword that everybody thinks is going to fix everything. And so, but one of the things you and I kind of help our clients understand is kind of how they can begin to make incremental investments and build a strategy around AI. What are some of the ways, given limited resources, that we have found successful in helping our clients begin this journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. It sounds like such common sense to state it, but within the practice of creating the right architecture to support not just AI but the business on a day-to-day basis, you really have to start with the sort of the end case, right? What are we trying to do? What is the business trying to accomplish? And then work your way backwards from there, right? So if we're trying to make certain decisions that are going to impact the profitability, the effectiveness of the organization, what data elements are going to be necessary to drive that decision process, right? Drive it in an effective way. There are a lot of customers of ours that are collecting a ton of data, right? Just pretty much everything. But making sense out of that requires asking that question first of what are we trying to do, right? And then working your way backwards. We also give a lot of counsel around what in the software development world for many years we called the strangler pattern. It sounds kind of severe, but really another analog would be how do you eat the elephant one bite at a time? So how do you make these incremental changes to your business while you're in motion, right? So how do I construct my data strategy while I'm still having to keep the lights on every day? There was a term several years ago that we called bimodal IT, which kind of encapsulated this. We got to have one track that's just business as usual, but I have to have another track that's strategically and incrementally making those changes. And we work with clients a lot to understand where they can start to make those bites into the elephant, right? What are the best places to start? Kind of decoupling the architecture so that you can modernize it in pieces.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Anthony, I want to ask you, I've heard you, you know, you're one of our senior data scientists here at Sparq. But I've heard you talk about this in very simple terms. Sometimes you think data scientists, you kind of data scientists, rocket scientists, and it's like, it's all ethereal. But one of the ways I've heard you discuss this is about telling a story. Can you talk about kind of that data story, kind of adding to what Stephen said about kind of starting from the kind of where you want to go and getting there? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. To Stephen's point, it's identifying where you're looking to go and then working backwards from there. And when you start looking at the data, you'll identify that there's a lot to be understood from the data. There's a story within the data, how it was collected, what types of data were collected at that period in time, how it can be used to answer questions within the business. So there's these nuggets that you can find within the data as you start understanding and getting clear on what you're looking to answer, and also understanding what your data is saying.
Exactly. Ken, when we're talking about collecting data, again, I always have my geek hat on where I think the more data, the better, and all the cool stuff we can do with data. But when I'm talking to friends, over coffee or whatever, collecting data is kind of viewed as a negative thing. What are some ways that we have talked to our clients around the ethics of data collection? Because if we're telling a story, there's PII, there's things like that we are sometimes collecting data that could be personal or relevant. So how do we deal with the data privacy and ethics?
Yeah, I mean, and what you're talking about really is data governance, right? A policy that helps establish a framework around your data. That's going to help you manage the data quality. It's going to enforce standardization. You'll have policies that will reflect how you manage and control data that is regulated, PII, PCI, PHI. It'll help you also establish like a clear data ownership and provide accountability, right? So through different techniques, you can provide accountability of that data, make sure the data stewards are maintaining that data and that quality. And of course, don't keep what you don't need, right? If there's information out there that you don't need, go ahead and get rid of it, because there's no point in keeping it around if it's not useful.
That's awesome. One of the things that we talk about sometimes, I'm going to pick on you again, Anthony. John, don't worry, I have not forgotten about you. I just needed him to smile like that. Anthony, one of the things that we deal with, there's the one side that Ken was talking about of having data you don't need. But one of the things that, again, I've heard you talk about is what to do when we have gaps in our data. We're not able to tell the story we want to tell because we don't have the data we need to have. What are some ways that we can help fill in, not only going forward, but inferring going backward? Like how do we fill in data gaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can give you a good concrete example. One of the clients that I worked with had a ton of telematics data. Unfortunately, they didn't have roadway data that needed to go with that data set. So we had to look for a data set that would be able to match with our data set to basically accompany that data. The other thing we didn't have was weather data. So we were looking to basically answer certain questions about roadway information, understanding the weather at that period of time and other issues. So identifying what you currently have on hand, what gaps you might have with that data, and then identifying, do we need to go out and acquire that data or partner with another company to get that data? There's multiple ways to go about doing that, but you don't, even though you might have a ton of data, doesn't mean you have the right data, and that's where you have to identify those gaps and understand. To Stephen's point, working backwards, what are we looking to answer, and if we have the right data to answer those questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
John, so we're talking about large volumes of data here. What are strategies where we're working with our clients to help them deal with manage the volume of data, but also make sure that the quality and cleanliness of that data is what it should be?
Yeah, I think again it goes back to what we've kind of been talking about is stepping in and saying, okay, what's our end goal here? Like we have all of this data and there's a ton of data that you can pull from. Um, and so at the end of the day, it's sitting back and going, okay, from a business process, from what our goals are, like chipping away to figure out what is important to us and working through. I like to use the analogy of if I'm going to if I'm going to teach my son how to play soccer, like there's specific goals that I have for him. And of course, I want him to score. And if I just yell at him about scoring, then they're not going to do anything, right? I look at the data and I say, well, you're not scoring enough goals, son. You need to score more goals. That doesn't really help him. So at the end of the day, it's sitting with him and understanding, okay, what's going to cause those goals. And what we figured out as we were going through this exercise with him is it's really just ball touches, right? So the more times he touches a ball, the better he's going to be as a soccer player and get those shots on goal and work that down and getting past all this trend stuff and just yelling, hey, we got to make our trend better and specific action. So we would have him walk around our house just kicking the ball and dribbling the ball around the house to figure that out. So, and at that point, once you know what you need and once you know the actions that you need to take, now you can go look at that data and walk through and say, okay, how do I take this data and move forward with it and be able to get the answers that we're looking for? And sometimes that's really like, hey, guess what? Out of all this huge data, we don't have the data that we actually need. So let's forget about collecting this data, this side of data, and let's focus on what we actually truly need and work through a process. And it really just comes down to, what story you're trying to tell, similar to what Anthony's saying. So yep.
Could somebody, and I'll just throw this open to the panel, one of the things that we talk about when we're talking about retiring or archiving data that may not be needed is the idea of cold storage. Like, what does that look like practically? Anthony, Stephen, could one of you talk about just the idea of putting data in cold storage? I one time teasingly asked Anthony if there was actually a freezer involved, freezer and hard drives, and he laughed at me. I knew the answer, but I thought but yeah, Anthony or Stephen, one of you talk just about the idea of that accessible yet long-term storage of data, that you're not getting rid of it, but it's not also affecting your performance and throughput, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely. So I think when we were discussing that before, Josh, it was identifying what is relevant data. A good example is a lot of times companies, look back, let's say 3 to 5 years. Anything prior to that is not relevant. So you want to put that in cold storage, so you're not spending a bunch of money on keeping that data available when you don't need to pay for that. And the idea is to put it into location. And these are all the major services: AWS, GCP, Azure. they have the ability to basically take that data and put it in a location so that it's still accessible, but it's not accessible immediately. It might take a while for you to access the data, but you're paying less to store that data. The idea is to separate what is relevant data versus non-relevant data. And you might need to have, additional data for 10 years as an example. And you just take that data and you put it into cold storage. You pay less money on it. If you ever need it, you still have access to it.
Yeah, and I would
And-
also
and
point
just-
out you can. Oh, go ahead, Stephen. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Kevin, please.
Oh,
Ken, sorry,
was-
please go ahead.
I was just going to throw out that accessing that data can be as easy as creating metadata tags around that information, right? So you can find it quickly should you need to go back and pull it out of the archives.
Yeah, and then just tacking on to that, I think there's another aspect of overall data architecture that it's not quite the same metaphor as cold storage, but understanding what you need from a almost more synchronous type of vantage point, like more real time, and what data can be at arm's length, right? So not all the way out into cold storage, but more asynchronous use of data. For instance, do I need to run a real-time report on customer behavior? Maybe not. Maybe that can be more asynchronous, where I can collect that data, put it more into a warehouse type of construct, right? As opposed to something that could be, immediately accessible from a performance point of view. To Anthony's point that he had said about cold storage, that's priced differently, right? So you can get a more cost-effective architecture. Again, understanding the stories around how you want to use that data. It's not just the type of questions I'm going to answer, but what kind of performance do I expect? And getting a response to those questions that I'm asking. And that should reflect into your overall data architecture and your data strategy as well, right? Where am I going to hold that if I need it immediately? Where am I going to hold it if I need it not quite immediately, but fairly readily? And then where can I put it if I only go and access that every once in a while, which is that concept again of cold storage. But it is a thought process that you have to go through. Again, having that business driver layer in there saying, what's the immediacy here, right? What kind of response cycle do I need around the different aspects of my data?
Yeah,
And
and getting back to governance, don't forget to document that in your policies so you can present
Right.
that in an audit if you need to.
And I think a lot of that comes down to our relationship as techies to the business. And I think that's where a lot of things break down when it comes to data governance, when it comes to what's needed and those types of things, is that there's you kind of need a Google Translate for business speak and tech speak, because you could be saying the same thing, but you don't understand each other because you don't understand the other side of it. And I think that's where we come in very handy, because we have a expertise among everything, and we've jumped into businesses and have to understand what what the business process is, and that and what the actual industry experience there is for that, to be able to speak both languages and to be that translator. I built part of my career on doing that, is being able to understand the business side and the tech side and be able to translate that. So when they ask for the time, I'm not we're not telling them how to build a watch. We're just telling them it's 3 p.m. right? And do you want that in Mountain and Central?
Yep, I agree. And I think one of the things we're talking about here, and John, you touched on it, is this is not a purely technical endeavor. I've worked in consulting for a long time, and it's very often that the business and the engineering groups are separated either locationally or by floors, or it's very rare that you get a good intersection of both business and engineering. And I think for us to use the metaphor we've been using about storytelling, I think it's very easy for the engineering team to be telling one story or driving towards one story, and the business needing the answers kind of in a choose your own adventure story. They need the answers to these questions. And so I think the cultural aspect, John, that you're talking about is critically important. Like to build a company culture that that allows both sides to understand what the other's asking. John, you're always you invariably are in the weeds of this with our clients. What are some pointers that we could offer the audience around other than just making sure that the two sides of the coin are talking, or two sides of the house are talking, what are ways that we can kind of inculcate this culture of making sure we're telling the same story?
I think the biggest thing is making sure to understand that the person across the table from you may not be understanding what you're saying. I remember an experience with a business where you had a department working doing doing data, because everyone's doing data, regardless of whatever um piece they are within the company. Everyone's using data. A lot of times that's why Excel is the most, utilized BI tool out there, is because that's easy to understand and go through. So, it long story short, you had a um you had one side of the business basically downloading from a reporting tool and making it all up in Excel, and paying probably about like 2 to 3 people to download it and convert it into Excel. And you had the BI department going, "Hey, I don't know why, I don't know why they're doing this." And it was always like, "You're wrong." And so I was able to go in, and I was an FTE at this time. I was able to go into that department and go, "This is ridiculous. Why am I exporting out Excel if this tool can do it?" This is how I started my career. And so I went to the manager and I was like, "Hey, BI," I was like, "Hey, this doesn't make sense. Like help me understand what we need to do." He's like, "Well, all they've told me is that it's wrong. They've never actually came and told me what was wrong." So I explained what was wrong to him. He fixed it within like 30 minutes, like just typing into it. And then all the reporting started coming to, all the reporting started coming out of the BI tool versus Excel, and it saved so much time and so much effort and money that we could focus on doing what we needed to do, which was making sure that we were resourcing the call center correctly. And so allowed times to actually answer questions and walk through. And so I think it's really enabling those business users who are technical to speak into that, the technical side of it. And also on the opposite side of that is understanding that, I need to help we need to help each other,
Yeah.
and taking a step back and realizing that, like, they're not the problem, you're not the problem's in front of you, and attacking the problem versus attacking the person. Because I feel like there's a pride there that happens that you have a hard time getting across. So as a culture within a business is keeping those things open, asking good questions, and making sure that we don't allow, "Hey, you're wrong," and attacking each other versus attacking what the problem actually is, which is we need to make sure that, like, the data is solid, and promoting that type of a culture.
No, I 100% agree. And you mentioned BI. Ken, one of the things, if we're staying on this data storytelling kind of motif, I think that data are the words to the story, but the illustrations in the story are kind of the findings, the data analytics and BI side of things. What do we need to be aware of in building a body of data that that can be easily reported on and easily visualized? What are some things we should keep in mind?
Yeah, it really depends on how we're actually accessing that data and how we're putting information together, right? So, the data that we're processing needs to be clearly defined. Again, we want to make sure we don't have data in the data set that's not necessary. So we remove things that are unneeded, and then aligned with organizational goals is a major requirement. So.
Anyone else have something to add on?
I think part of it starts with how we and it goes back to that culture, right, that we were talking about, is really just attacking those types of things at the beginning of the data versus at the end. So a lot of times we decide to um deal with bad data after the fact, and we do a lot of gymnastics to get there, which makes for very complex and clunky pipelines and architecture, because we're trying to fix a problem that should have been fixed in the source. And so again, it's building those relationships with the people who are developing the system and making sure that, hey, this field doesn't need to be a free text field because we're not going to get accurate data if I can just put whatever I want to into it. Let's make it a drop down, and those types of things. So having a data first mentality, it's a whole business endeavor. It's not just the IT department. And again, it comes down to building those relationships so that way you can speak into it and be compelling enough to tell the story to let them know like how that affects their data and how quickly they can get their answers. So at the end of the day, it's working with the business versus working against the business, which I see a lot in with the tech space. And again, it comes down to building that culture.
Yeah, and data lifecycle management, right, and maintaining that data, establishing processes to kind of make sure that from creation to retirement, the data is useful through that process.
And just to piggyback on that, but also to tie into a question that we just got from Jason. Thank you for entering the question in. And it is a good one. It's how do you determine, because we've referenced this a couple of times, how do you determine what data is needed and what data is not needed, right? So how do you create that dividing line? And Ken, you just mentioned this a second ago. I'll start that off again by reiterating the integration between the technology side of the house and the business side of the house so that we can answer the business questions, right? So a lot of times that's going to inform you. And Anthony refers to this as the story you're trying to tell. So having both sides of the equation, both the business and the technical side of the house, integrated to the point where everybody understands the story that needs to be told, right? Or the question that needs to be answered. There is a translation that occurs to the technical side of the team, which says, well, in order to tell that story then, or in order to answer that question, these are the data elements that we need, right, to do that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not collecting other pieces of data, right, in your ecosystem. These are just the ones we're going to pull together, aggregate to answer that question or tell that story, right? So it is a matter of telling the story or answering the question efficiently, right? Having that, kind of understand what the supporting data needs to be. There's a conversation that occurs there between, again, the business side of the house and the technical side of the house. And sometimes, as we've worked with clients, it includes a conversation with their customers, right? Sometimes those customers are internal and sometimes they're external, but asking them what's important, right? So going all the way out to where is that story going to be told, or where is that question, the answer to that question eventually going to live, and understanding that audience. If you work again your way backwards from there, I think that's a bit of a divining rod in terms of determining what data is necessary, right? The impulse from a technical point of view will be, well, let's put more in there just in case, right? And this is where, we're kind of speaking around it a little bit, but you have to resist the impulse to do that, because that will create bloat in your data model and in the structures that you're trying to create, a lack of efficiency and performance, obviously, but also overhead, right? So the more you're collecting, the more that's going to cost you from a real point of view, right? Storage, et cetera, which is almost free these days, but still, right, there's a cost associated with that. And then kind of go into that idea of, well, how ready do we need it, right, in order to tell this story, and kind of working your way up from that. Jason, hopefully that helps answer your question a bit, but always work your way back from the use case of the story.
And to kind of piggyback on that, it's understanding what is the goal of the business, and then finding out how do we hit those goals, which is our KPIs, right? Specifically. And from those KPIs, how do I tell if it's improving or decreasing in what we want it to be happening? And that's where you get your trends. And then asking the questions on if the trend's going down or up, because sometimes, it's good either way. What action and what levers can I pull to make it go the other way? And that can be done in a, that could be done in a session, that could be done just sitting at desks talking to people. But I think that process, and that goes back to my example with my kid playing soccer, and you can use a business one. Like if I want more sales, I end up needing to make more calls, right? And then being able to see, hey, if I see that other people are discounting stuff, is there a lever I can quickly pull to discount our stuff? Not necessarily race to the bottom, but is there to quickly inflate it and then move forward? And so finding those actions that change to get us to our goal is the important piece of that.
One thing
Yeah, and I was going to say organizational alignment, but also being able to classify your data so you can quickly categorize it. So you can say, this is the data I need to answer this particular question, right? So data classification is also an important factor in determining what is needed and what is not needed.
Josh, one thing I was going to mention also is I always tend to urge clients to collect data at the lowest granularity. What I mean by that is you can always roll your data up, but you can never roll it back down. So it's important that when you collect data, that you collect it at whatever level it's coming in at. And what I mean by that is if it's coming in at a day level, keep it at that day level. You don't want to roll that up into something else because you'll have a hard time going back and try to identify that data at a lower granularity. So granularity is really important when you're collecting data. It gives you the ability to look at various levels within that data. But if you try to bring in summarized data into a system, it's very challenging to ever go back and get that detailed view of the data. So that I would urge people to always collect at the lowest granularity as much as possible.
And I would also piggyback on that by saying that like old school data, like it was very expensive to store data. You had to have your own server farms, you had to have your own information. Now with cloud, storage is cheap. And so collect a ton, put it away, and then in case you ever need it, it's okay to have more data than you need and to sift through it versus what we used to have to do, which is roll it up in granularities, because guess what? The jobs took a long time. Storage was expensive. And so nowadays the whole, like, that's why you have ETL versus ELT, right? Extract, transform, load used to be the case because we wanted to make sure that we were only storing the data that we really needed because it was very expensive, the process and everything else. Now that those things are becoming cheaper, it's turned into extract, load, transform, which means, hey, let's extract it, let's load everything. That's where the instance of data lakes come through. And then to walk through so that way we have the data if we need it. And you can put that in cold storage. You can do a bunch of different things to make it cost efficient. And then let's sift through it and let's ask those questions that we need to ask. And then hopefully the answer would be, yeah, we have that data. It's right here. At the raw stage. I'm not saying transform everything. I'm saying like at least you have it in the raw stage to be able to play around with it.
Yeah, I think, and I want to use a word that we haven't used yet, or at least a lot, and that's the word strategy. I think the answer to this question is multi-vectored. It is not I think it's really easy to say, what do we need and not need? What do we store and not store? What can we afford and not afford? I think that there's a three-dimensional multi-vector strategy to the way we at Sparq think about this, and it's been referenced here. It's not, we want to think about data granularity, like Anthony talked about data quality and getting the right data, like Stephen and Ken have talked about. But I think what John was alluding to is there's also an availability vector that affects how you make decisions about whether or not you store data. The answer may be more often yes than no, but you need to look at what horizons you need that data and how available you need that data. What performance metrics and KPIs do you need to be able to retrieve that data? And so I think one of the things you're going to realize where we go from a story in a book to a story in a 3D movie, I think that's really more the analogy for when we talk to our clients about data strategy is we're first understanding all of the current state, understanding all of the players, knowing where everything, all the bodies are buried, etc. And then we're going to apply this three-dimensional model on it that's going to talk about cost, that's going to talk about which data, that's going to talk about how finely granular we want the data, how available the data is. And if that sounds complicated, it is. There's a lot. That's why we work with our clients to help them make this simpler, because we do this. I was talking to a client that had a relatively small amount of data, and they were making decisions as if they had just teraquads of data. And we actually deal with clients that have just voluminous data lakes. And we've simplified their data architecture to the point where they can simply ask a question. What about this? And so I think one of the reasons you work with a company like Sparq is because we've worked with large data models, small data models. We've seen what works and what principles to apply. And one of the things I want to turn the corner as we kind of wrap up and get to questions. And John, I'll pitch this first to you, but then to the rest of the team. One of the exciting things the webinar was laying the groundwork for AI strategy. We've actually turned this on its head. We are building data strategies now, leveraging AI tooling. And we're finding that we're able to make the complexity much more simple because we know what we're looking for and we train AI tools to do that. John, could you talk a little bit about that? And maybe, and Stephen, I don't know, this could be a really great topic for our next webinar, just to talk about how to build, because another way to think about the story is the strategy. The technical word for that story we're trying to tell is your data strategy that feeds into your AI strategy. And that could maybe, I'll let everybody behind the curtains. That may be our next webinar. But John, could you talk about that a little bit, about how the success we've seen around using AI tooling to build data strategy?
Yeah, so I think we think about AI a little bit differently. I think your data strategy and your AI strategy can't be decoupled, right? Like AI and data go together like peanut butter and jelly, or peanut butter and chocolate, maybe a better way if you like Reese's. But at the end of the day, instead of using AI after everything's done to ask questions and to do a bunch of fun stuff, using AI to actually go through the tedious tasks of migrating from one ETL tool to a different one, from one database to the other, is has seen a lot of traction, because at the end of the day, no one likes looking at Excel and actually moving, making sure that the data is correctly, or putting it in a specific schema or a specific data type. Being able to utilize LLMs to look at the data, find patterns, uh, identify without a lot of programming and coding. So instead of doing a bunch, because a lot of people are, well, you can do tests and DBT and all this other stuff. Yeah, you can. But instead of me having to write all of that code, I write a prompt and it'll look at it and give me what the differences are, where it doesn't match the pattern, the records where it doesn't match. So that way I can push that data in correctly. And then I have a list of exceptions to be able to say, okay, what do you do with this? And for the fact that it will learn what that exception is and to handle it the same way in the future is amazing. And we've seen a lot of progress, like taking processes from like 3 to 4 months down to, 3 days, right? And seeing the efficiency gains at that point, or being able to, instead of someone having to manually enter in data, having AI look at those PDFs and be able to read handwriting, using some OCR as well, but being able to give me a score of whether this is correct or not. And for me to be able to train it and teach it to do that type of work, it allows our analysts, it allows our employees to do what's important. It's similar to, instead of exporting and putting it into Excel and doing stuff, it allowed other things to happen to be able to make the business better versus these tedious tasks that no one really enjoys doing at the end of the day. If you do, I'm sorry. But I know I don't. And and being able to add more value to the business versus just, um taking a time box and looking at stuff. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of it is the efficiency gains and using it more as a tool to help make processes better of ingesting data, and even, how do you work through historical data that you have two different source systems that you're migrating from one source to the next. That historical data, how do you handle it, becomes a lot easier and a lot quicker, and you have a thread that goes through versus, well, we're just going to start with this new system and that's going to be our data. And we don't really have a lot of historical data to go off of now because we didn't have the time or the money to pay for someone to go through all of that historical data and make it align with our new system. You can utilize AI for that side of things, the LLMs for that. So, yep.
Yeah,
I'll
just
stop
as an
there.
example, Josh, I just come off of a client where we did exactly this, right? We used AI to catalog. They had hundreds of data sources external to their company, thousands of jobs processing that data. And we used AI to help catalog those data sources. And we used AI to help us identify endpoints and lineage of data, right? And the next step is to use that AI to consolidate all those jobs under a single orchestration process. So AI has definitely been a great tool for us to use in helping us understand data ecosystems across any organization.
And I just saw a question from Abner. What AI tools are you currently used to optimize these data strategies? Honestly, we're utilizing a lot of times the database ability. So with Snowflake, they have Cortex, right? And you can utilize and build. We're building them as we're going through, right? We're kind of building our own custom processes for our clients, utilizing Snowflake Cortex to do these things. Usually LLMs, obviously, and you have access to a bunch of different LLMs within Cortex, but at the end of the day, like there aren't a lot of there. I don't know, Ken, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. There's not a lot of tools that you can just bring in to do these things. I think we're at that level set with AI to where you're just kind of utilizing Python and Snowflake, or you can use other database and other LLMs as well, like open AIs through Azure. But at the end of the day, we're kind of building this, and which is a good thing because as Josh alluded to, like it's not one size fit all. And so a lot of times the tool is specifically built for one specific thing, and then they add on to their what they're supposed to do. And they're really good at this one thing, but then they're not really so good at everything else that they're trying to be. And so it's really nice to be able to go into a business and build something that works for them because not all businesses are one size fit all.
Yeah, and the data sources, right, are not all one size fit all either.
Mhm.
So, we're so essentially, Abner, we're building out a tool set for us to utilize for our clients and customers, and eventually, hopefully, that'll be something we can release to clients and they can use on their own as well if they need to do some data discovery or cataloging, right, going forward for maintenance. So, the whole idea is to be able to connect the different data sources to evaluate and interrogate those database management systems to come out with a bunch of information that we can use to help us migrate data or mitigate some data issues that they may have. So,
And I would say it's more of a framework than it is a set of tools, Ken, at the end of the day, because again, every business is different. And so I and even everyone's implementation of SAP or Salesforce is different, right? And
very much
so
so.
even if you can take the same tool or the same source system that you're utilizing, and for one company, their Salesforce is set up completely different than the other one. So
Yeah,
I think it really takes a little bit of people coming in and understanding that and helping to tailor it to them, and then helping to train their people on how to use it and how to change things, that framework, right, to do better. So that way we can leave it and they can be functioning on their own, that kind of paired delivery model that we kind of go with.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep,
and
agree.
and Abner, just if you are curious, right, about some of the tools that we have built, I mean, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to showcase some of these to you. If you are curious, anybody on this webinar, if you're curious about kind of the framework or the tools that we have built as starting points for some of this value proposition, we are happy to walk through some of them with you.
Yep, absolutely. And I know we're right at time, and so I want to go ahead and wrap up. But before we wrap up, I wanted to make sure, Laura, were there any last questions that we need to make sure that we've missed? If not, we can go ahead and wrap up. But I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss anybody's question already.
Them all.
Okay. So I think that just summarizing what we've talked about today, at Sparq, you're going to notice that we are not taking the approach of hypothetically talking about data and AI. Our approach is very much hands-on with our clients, solving specific problems. And the framework that John and Ken and others have talked about is something that's evolving in real time. It's taking on almost a life of its own in many ways, because we're using this framework to solve problems, and then we're iterating on that framework to solve a different problem. And what it's allowing us to do is begin to bring data readiness to our clients in a much faster, but even more important, much more risk mitigated way, to add value and begin to see the benefits of this data intelligence way faster. And John even referenced our BFSI team is doing form ingestion and document recognition, and and making those complex tasks very simple. We're doing this in manufacturing and healthcare across all our verticals. We're seeing just an explosion of using the things that Sparq has become expert at over the years, really leveraging that to help our clients. And so I want to echo what Stephen said. If any of you are interested in hearing more about any of these topics, please reach out to us on our website. We have white papers, et cetera, talking about things we've seen in our different verticals on our website. You can access us via LinkedIn, email. We want to connect with you, because the way that we've seen this grow is by really getting in the trenches with our clients and our prospects to really add value and drive value quickly. So I really appreciate the time you spent today with us, and we will look forward potentially to talking about data strategy and creating a data roadmap the next time we get together. Thank you all so much.
Excellent. Bye, guys.